You found us. Hello, and welcome back. You're tuned in to Wine in 9, where all you need to learn about wine in 9 minutes or less. Here's your host, Bob Cappuccino.
Today's Wine in 9 is all about how sparklers and champagnes are made. On our Wine in 9 podcasts, we typically won't go into the methods or technologies. But please allow me this indulgence. I'm going to talk about the methods because they're interesting, much more so than many other wines. Also, you'll realize how difficult the process is, hence a little more cost, but a lot more quality and taste. So here we go. First, let's talk about the different production methods that are used to convert still wine into sparkling wine. Now, there's two main methods of production that we'll talk about today. The first one is called the méthode champenoise, and this is the method that was perfected in the Champagne region of France. And only the people from that particular region in Champagne are allowed to use this terminology. In other parts of France and around the world where they make sparkling wines with this same method, it has to be called méthode traditionnelle, or in Italian they'll call it metodo classico, and the Spaniards simply call it cava. But it's the same process, just a different name. And the second production method that I want to talk about today is called Charmat, or also known as the Montanotti method. And it's used all over the world to produce both high quality and even less expensive bubbles. But let's get started first with the traditional method, the méthode champenoise. The first thing you have to know with all of these wines, whether they be méthode champenoise or they be Charmat, Montanotti, the winemaker has to first make a really good base wine, because that's what's going to become ultimately the sparkling wine. So you really have to understand that this is very, very serious in terms of how they have to be approached. Once that base wine is made, they put it into the heavy champagne bottle that you all recognize. You've got to make sure that your bottle can withstand the pressure that's inside and not explode. So the base wine is placed into the bottle. A little bit of yeast and a little bit of sweet wine is also put in. And then they cap it with a crown cap, like the old soda bottle kind of cap. Then those bottles are put into either what they call a riddling rack or a gyro pallet with the neck down. And over a period of time, these bottles will be manipulated either by hand or electrically, and they'll shake the bottle slightly so that as the yeast consumes the sugar and creates the CO2 that makes the bubbles, the yeast slides into the neck of the bottle up against the crown cap. Depending on the house, depending on what they're trying to do, they're going to lay the wine down anywhere for 22 to 60 months to allow the carbon dioxide to be captured and form the bubbles. When we make a regular table wine, that gas is allowed to escape into the atmosphere. But when you're making sparkling wine, the key here is to capture it. Now, during this time, the wine's going to pick up flavor and aromatic qualities, and sometimes you'll call it fresh bread or yeastiness when the wine is finally finished. And this comes from the characteristic of the yeast inside the bottle. So after the wine is ready and the house decides that the wine needs to be finished, they do a process called the disgorgement. Now, all of the yeast particles, all the dead yeast cells, whatever, have gathered against the cap of the bottle over the period of months that it is sat. And now they need to get that out of there. So what they do is they freeze the neck of the bottle, they pop the little cap off, and of course the plug is vacated and takes all the yeast sediment with it, and also takes a little bit of the wine along with it. So now they have to replenish that. They have to put a little bit more in there. It's at this point that the house decides what the level of sweetness or dryness this particular wine will be. If they leave it the way it is and use the same wine as what's in that bottle, you'll have a Brut Nature, which is the driest of all of the champagne types. After that comes extra brut, then there's brut, then there's extra dry, which sounds kind of like, well, isn't extra dry, shouldn't that be the driest? It's not. It's slightly sweet. There's sec, which means dry in French, and then there's doux, which means sweet in French. So you could actually have also make a sweet champagne. Not done very often, but they can be made. The whole process, as you can see, takes quite a bit of time. This is the reason that these wines are as expensive as they are. Now, keep in mind also that the more that these wines stay on the yeast, the finer the bubble, which the French will call bide, and the finer the mousse, which is a little foam that forms around the top ring of the wine in your glass. And they'll be at their finest when these wines have had their longest time in the bottle making the bubbles. As I said before, all the sparkling wines that are made in the world from this method, there's Cavas in Spain, Franciacortas in Italy, Sect in Germany, sparklers from the New World in California, New Mexico, use this process. Generally speaking, what they try to do is use the traditional French grapes, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier. Now, these are the grapes that they must use in Champagne, along with a couple of other smaller grapes that they may introduce. But in general, this is what people will do. And it's also important to know that if the house decides that they want to make the wine only from the Chardonnay, they will call it a Blanc de Blanc. If they're going to make it from the red grapes, Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier, then they'll call it Blanc de Noir. But in general, what you'll most come up against is something called Brut, which is always a blend of those particular grapes. And you'll see that the world over. Now, of course, in certain areas, they will also use their own indigenous grapes, but I'll mention that in a bit. I want to get now into the Charmat or the Martinotti process. They do the same thing as we started off with the Méthode Champenois by making a base wine. The better the base wine, the better the outcome. Okay? The base wine is sweetened and added yeast, and it's put into a pressurized tank called an autoclave. And these tanks are 500 to 4,000 gallons in size. We really feel that the smaller tanks give you a finer product, but the bigger companies, of course, are making it in much bigger quantities, so the bigger gallonage. The CO2 is captured and forms the bubbles in as little as 15 days, but they're going to be coarse bubbles. They're going to look more like the kind of bubble you'll see in seltzer water than you will see in a fine product. Most quality producers will keep it under pressure for 30 to 40 days at least, because the longer they keep it in the autoclave, the finer the bubbles, because the bubbles will fracture and they get smaller and smaller and smaller. And the most prized, of course, the ones that look like little tiny pinpricks. That's what you look for, whether it's in Méthode Champenois or even in Charmat. You want the finest bubble. Now, where in the Méthode Champenois, keeping the wine on the yeast for so many months, even years, will give that wine that bready, yeasty characteristic. This isn't what you find when you do the Charmat process. Usually what will happen here is you're going to wind up with much more fruit-forward and more highly aromatic wines. Now, this is perfect for wines like Asti Spumante and Prosecco, okay? And it gives them their really bright fruited appeal. Now, big wineries, and I mean big wineries, can use this process, and they turn out pretty insipid stuff because they basically put in Thompson seedless grapes, lesser grapes. So again, what you put in is what you're going to get out. But you can use this process also to make the real cheap stuff that you see on the shelves. So just keep that in mind. As I said before, the producers will generally try to use the classic French grapes. But we also find that, this process, when you use local grapes, like in Spain for Cava, produce an interesting wine in and of itself. It's not champagne, it is sparkling, and you're usually earthier because of the use of these grapes. But no matter where you go, where grapes are grown, you can, as long as you can make a good base wine with local grapes that have the necessary acidity so that they can basically be converted into a sparkling wine, you will find very interesting sparkling wines from almost every area, and made with grapes that, again, too long to even list here today. So that's it. I hope this little tutorial gave you some insight. I'm Bob Cappuccino.
Thanks for listening to Wine in 9. Give us your feedback, good, bad, whatever. We'd love to hear from you. Look for Wine in 9 across social media. We're at winein9.com, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So grab a glass and join, subscribe, download, tweet, whichever you choose.